So we're sitting here in a car with Dr. Dolf de Roos, and I had the privilege of reading this book, Real Estate Riches, some nearly 20 years ago. And it had a profound impact on my life, and I went out and started investing. I did my first deal when I was 22. But one thing that you read about and you understand from property investors is that commercial is where the sophisticated people play. And I've read Dolf's other books, which is about commercial property investing, but there's always massive barriers to entry and it's a lot more complicated to get into. Dolf, from your perspective, tell us just a little bit about the evolution from residential to commercial and why sophisticated investors prefer commercial, and really how can other people participate in it?
Wow, well, that's very simple to pose the question, but the answer to it can take quite a while. In fact, I run a 2-day course on just why most people would do well to sort of transition from residential property to commercial. But I'll try and encapsulate it, and it occurred to me because most people start in residential. I started in residential. I make no bones about it. I bought a wooden villa that was split into 2 units, and it had 2 more units out the back. And I think it's fair to say everyone starts away. And the reason why I think we start with residential is we know what to expect in a residential property. By that I mean that if you look at a house and there's no front door, you'd probably notice it. Or if you did a walkthrough and there was no kitchen there, you'd notice it. But for many of us, we'd look at a commercial property and we're not quite sure what to look for that might be missing. We don't know enough about it. And the reason is obviously we all live in a home, but we don't necessarily all do the things that people end up doing in commercial properties. But then I started to look at some of the people that had made it really big in real estate. And by really big, I'm talking about $100 million or more. And I could only find one person who'd made that much money with residential real estate. Without exception, all of the others had achieved that huge net worth with commercial real estate. So that got me thinking. And there is a logistical answer. For instance, if you were to own $100 million of residential real estate, you'd have a lot of lavatories and faucets and taps that were under your, not control, but that you had to manage and you'd have to maintain. Whereas with commercial property, your 100 million deployed in commercial real estate might only involve a dozen lavatories and a few front doors. It could be one big office building or an airport structure or a big industrial complex. So it seemed inherently more stable. So I started investigating this. I wanted to know what are the relative merits. And I came up with an incredible array of advantages. In fact, these advantages are so stark that when you first hear them, they sound self-explanatory, and you say, well, that kind of makes sense, but you don't realize how impactful they are on your investing life until you buy your first commercial property. And I'm telling you, once you've bought a commercial property or a participation in a commercial property, if it's in a syndicate form or shared ownership of some sort, then my contention is that you'll never want to go back to residential. In fact, you probably don't even want to look at residential properties anymore, because even though you think, well, that's got a good return, it might be 8 or 10 or 15% return, and it's got great growth prospects, and it's in an area where you tend to always have tenants, you don't want to get into it because there's still too much work involved, and it's too itsy-bitsy for you. So let's go through some of the, as I call it, advantages of commercial real estate. And one of the first ones that comes to mind is when you have a residential house, you might collect rent of, say, $1,200 a month, whatever it is, but out of that gross rental, it's you, the landlord, that has to pay for things like property taxes, insurance, maintenance. Whereas with commercial, it is typical. It's not always and exclusively so, but it's very typically that the tenants will be on what's called a triple net lease. That means net of property taxes, insurance, and maintenance. That means that in addition to the rent they pay to occupy the space that they lease from you, they will also agree to pay for the property taxes, or if it's a shared accommodation block on one type, their fair proportion of it to be prorated according to area or some other formula. And they pay the maintenance and they pay the insurance premiums. I mean, this is huge. So what we normally do with our commercial tenants is they don't pay us one amount per month, but they pay us 2 amounts per month. One is the base rental. If it's $28 a square foot, then it'll be times the number of square feet they've got. And the other one is the monthly proportion of the estimated annual operating costs. So if we know that last year, if you add up the insurance, maintenance, and the property taxes that it came to, I'm making this up, gosh, I'm tempted to say, $24,000. That means that every month they have to pay $2,000 towards this budgeted cost. And then at the end of the year, we do what's called a wash-up. We figure out what have they actually paid versus what have we actually been charged by the council and all those other rating authorities and people who charge us. The net effect is the tenants pay the outgoings. That means the rent you collect is net rent to you. That of itself is so hot I can't get over it. Here's another aspect to think about. Commercial tenants tend to earn their income at the premises. That means they've got a vested interest in keeping those things looking good. So I've never had a commercial tenant in a fit of frustration put a fist through a wall and then call you, the landlord, to say, hey, there's a hole in the wall, you better fix it. Have plenty of residential tenants who've done that, especially in the not so good areas. But as I say, commercial tenants tend to earn their money there. They want to keep that going. Let's talk about longevity of tenancies. Typically for residential, you get a 1-year lease. Occasionally there's a 2-year lease, and even more rarely we talk about 3-year leases. Now in some stronger markets you can get those, but typically it's 1 year at a time. And when that first year has expired, most tenants are reluctant to sign up for another year. They might go 6 months by 6 months, but even if they do a year at a time, that's generally a long stretch to have a tenant. Whereas with commercial tenancies, often they want a longer lease. Now I know the trend in recent years has been for the lease durations to shorten a bit. But I've been involved with properties in what's called the City of London. That's not all of London, but the inner part of London, where typical lease lengths have been 25 years. I've got properties still in the portfolio that have 20-year lease lengths. And typically for the smaller premises, your tenants will want 5-year leases with maybe a right of renewal, or that's the ability for the tenant to extend the lease for another period of 5 years. You'll have 8 plus 4 plus 4, or 10 plus 5 plus 5. That's kind of cool. I like that. So let's talk about another aspect, and this is the ability of tenants to pay the rent. All right, so if you've got a residential house, and let's say that's leased by someone who also leases his commercial space, and he can't afford to pay both. So the question becomes, is he going to pay the residential rent or is he going to pay the commercial lease? And almost without exception, he'll pay the commercial lease. And there are many, many reasons for that. But one is that the laws are much stricter regarding what you as a landlord can do to extract rent from a defaulting tenant when it comes to residential than when it comes to commercial. So in many parts of the world, there are stringent rules. In some places it gets bizarre, like in California, you generally can't touch a tenant. You can't even write a letter of complaint until 3 months have gone by. Whereas governments around the world tend not to stick their noses into commercial leases. I mean, you can't do anything that's immoral or illegal, but you can basically state what you want in those lease documents. So typically commercial leases say that if the rent isn't paid within 5 days of the due date, then there'll be a penalty payment of X%, and you'll start to accrue interest either on a daily basis or an infinite basis or something at the rate of maybe 1% a month or something like that. There's no getting around that. In many parts of the world, you can even distrain for rent. That means if your commercial tenant is behind by a certain number of days, you can change the locks and seize the premises. You can't seize any of the staff, that's considered kidnapping, but you can seize their plant and stock and equipment and inventory. And then you can sell it according to a very strict formula, certain minimum number of ads that has to be done by auction. The auction has to be advertised a certain minimum number of days beforehand, etc., etc. But you can do that. You can't do that with residential. So it's just easy. And because the tenants know that you can do that, they tend to pay the rent more regularly than they do on residential property. You know, the list goes on, and as I say, I can spend 2 days talking about this. Here's another thing. The commercial lease documents usually say that the tenant, before he can make any changes or modifications to the building or improvements, he has to get the landlord's permission. Well, that's all good and well. But there's also a clause in most commercial leases that the tenant has the right to ask the landlord to pay for these improvements. And then generally in that same lease, it will state that if the landlord agrees, the tenant will agree to pay extra rent at the rate of X% of the cost of the improvement. So let me give you an example. I had a tenant who had a sort of a 24-hour convenience store, and he wanted to tear down the front wall of his building and replace it with a glass wall. And he said that would increase visibility of his shop and increase traffic and improve it all. And it turns out that the cost of this improvement was about $100,000. So he contacts me and says, hey, I want to remove the front wall. I said, I don't like the idea so far. He said, no, I want to replace it with a glass curtain. I said, okay, I like that idea. You have my permission. He said, well, would you mind paying for it? And I said, how much is it going to cost? And he said, well, I've done all the quantity surveying on it, as it's called. It's 100,000. And I think he fully expected me to say, are you crazy? No way. But I said, sure. Because here's the deal. His interest rate on it was 8%. So look at it in very simplistic terms. I could spend $100,000 and get an 8% return. Of itself, that's not bad, right? Well, he was paying me extra rent equivalent to about 8%. So I was getting 8,000 extra from him. So just on a simple equation basis, it's a good deal. But it gets better than that, because the old wall was crumbling. It needed to be repaired. So part of that 100,000 capital expenditure that I paid for could be considered a repair, and therefore it was tax deductible to me. But the difference between the repair component and the cost of putting in the new glass curtain was about 80,000. That's considered an improvement, and you can depreciate that in some jurisdictions. So it's very typical that after you spend a certain amount of money, the value of the building goes up by more than what you've spent. In my case, the value went up by 200,000, even though I'd only spent 100,000. So what I did with this valuation, with this appraisal, is I went back to the bank and I said, Mr. Bank Manager, I've got here a new appraisal for 200,000 more. Will you lend me a modest, say, 50% on that? And he looked at it and he thought it was a great deal. So he agreed, and I got the 100,000 from the bank. Now remember, the net cost to me was only 90,000, so I had 10,000 to put in my pocket. I now hadn't spent any money on putting this glass curtain in, and I was still collecting the 8,000 a year extra. Of course, now I have to deduct my mortgage interest on the 100,000, and I think it was at about 4%. So at 4%, it cost me 4,000 a year. I was only getting $4,000 a year, whereas before I was getting 8,000. But before I was getting $8,000 on a net capital outlay of 90,000, and now I was only getting $4,000 on a capital injection of 10,000. I mean, that's a rate of return that is beyond infinite. It's crazy. And so I asked myself this question: why would you not do this? And when you add up all the advantages of commercial real estate, you just shake your head in disbelief that more people aren't doing it. And here's the funny thing, I think it's funny. So I've written a book on commercial real estate. It's got the very creative and imaginative title of Commercial Real Estate Investing. I've got a 12 CD course on commercial real estate investing. I've got a 6 DVD course on commercial real estate investing. I talk about this all over the world, and yet few people are still doing it. And I don't know if it's some conspiracy or something by those who are in the game who want to keep quiet about it because it's so lucrative. And I don't even think so. Often people will ask me, why do you keep teaching about real estate? Because you're giving yourself a lot of competition. And folks, the market is so incredibly big that it doesn't matter. There are some 7 billion people on this planet, and they all either live somewhere or aspire to live somewhere. Most of them live somewhere, so they've got a home of some sort. We all go shopping at supermarkets and convenience stores and buy petrol at a petrol station or gas at a gas station, depending on which country you're in. We all do these things. We all fly at airports and pick up rental cars from rental car facilities and store things in warehouses or buy things in shops that have been stored in warehouses. I think you get the drift. So it's there. The market is so big, it doesn't matter. And so I've spent all this time now talking about the advantages. I do concede there are 2 disadvantages of commercial real estate. And very quickly, to share what they are, is there's this perception that the value of commercial properties tends to be bigger on average than the value of most houses, so it's harder to get in because you need that 30% down payment. And the second perceived disadvantage is that banks tend to allow a lower loan-to-value ratio. So whereas on a residential property they may lend you 70 or 80, and in some extenuating circumstances even 90% of the value of a property. And if you think that's a lot, I've lived in markets where the banks would lend out 125% of the purchase price of a property. And if you don't know about that, we should talk. But anyway, in general, 70, 80%, whereas on commercial it's typically 50 or 60%. However, I've got mechanisms where you can overcome those, and if we can negate the effects of those 2 perceived negative things, then I think you'll come to the irreversible conclusion that commercial property has so many advantages, it is just worth pursuing. And we've sort of consumed all the time we're taking to get to our next property. By the way, the next property we're looking at is commercial, it's not residential. But there are just some thoughts as to why I'm not just impartial about it or slightly in favor of commercial. This is so exciting. Once you get it, life will never be the same. You can never go back to your original way of thinking once you understand just how lucrative commercial is. Anyway, I hope that gives you some incentive at the very least to find out a little bit more than perhaps you know already about commercial real estate. Thank you so much.